American patriot who has contributed invaluably to our security and well-being, Ms. Sandra R. Grimes. She's the author of Circle of Treason, a CIA account of traitor Aldrich Ames and the men he betrayed. The story of two dedicated CIA counterintelligence officers, Sandra Grimes and her co-author Gt Prologue. Their personal involvement to find the truth and get answers to the CIA's unparalleled loss in the mid-1980s. Through their tenacity, they solved the puzzle. I should add, this is also a story of tenacity with respect to getting the CIA to release the book. And there was a lot of determination to overcome 3 years of resistance, but they did it, and the CIA Security Review Office passed off on the book. Sandra Grimes joined the CIA in 1967, shortly after her graduation from the University of Washington with a degree in Russian. She began her climb through the ranks working the KGB and the GRU, and in the late 70s became a close professional colleague and friend of Gt Prologue, also serving in the counterintelligence group. By the late 1980s, in her words, quote, "My family had made sacrifices for me and my career over the years, and it was time I repaid them by spending more time on the home front," unquote. In 1991, having taken the decision to resign from the CIA, she was asked by a senior colleague if she would stay for one more assignment. She was asked, would she help Gt investigate the 1985 losses? Quoting one more time, she said, without hesitation, "He had made me the only offer I could never have refused. Our dead sources deserved advocates, and so began my participation in what later became known as the Ames mole hunt." We will not have Q's and A's after this presentation, but we're very fortunate that Sandra will join us across the street at the Postal Museum at the reception, and I hope you all get to talk to her there. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sandra Grimes.
Before I start, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fine. Thank you, Admiral Daly, for inviting me to talk about our book, Circle of Treason. And I have to admit, I'm pretty honored to be in front of such an accomplished group. Before I begin, I want to say a few words about my co-author and my good friend, Gt Prologue. Gt passed away 3.5 months ago after a relatively short and totally unexpected illness. While she did live to see Circle of Treason published, we both knew she was not going to be able to participate in success. So I am here today to represent both of us as I tell you about our story to try to determine who or what caused the wholesale loss of our Soviet sources in 1985 and in 1986. In 1991, that road led us to search for a traitor in our own organization. To make matters worse, we knew he would not be a stranger. He would be a co-worker, someone we had known for probably a very long time, and someone we saw frequently in the hallways of our headquarters building. But Circle of Treason is not just a story about how we identified a traitor in our midst. It's much more than that. For the first time, Gt and I are able to tell the story of his victims. Many of their stories are ours as well. We participated in the handling of some of the cases, and we watched as those we knew were arrested and executed. Now, always concerned that we might have made a mistake which led to their deaths is a burden no one wants to carry. But I have to tell you, that's exactly what a number of us in the Soviet and East European Division and other components in the Directorate of Operations had to do for the next 8 years until our traitor was identified. Altogether, the book details CIA's contact with 16 Soviet sources. All but one were intelligence officers. Most of them were victims, but several were not related to our traitor. Gene and I just included them because we thought they were fantastic stories. You may have noticed I have yet to mention the name of our mole. We all know who he is, Alder James, or, as he was known to us, Rick. And yes, he was a co-worker. And yes, Gene and I had known him over 20 years. And for me personally, in the mid-1970s, he and I were carpool partners. My reason for ignoring Rick is quite simple. I am not so certain Gene and I would have written this book if it were just the story of our involvement in what became known as the Ames Mole Hunt Team. Our goal, rather, was to tell the story of our assets, those we lost. And we believe the dedication of our book states it perfectly. It's simple and it's to the point. Circle of Treason is dedicated to General Polyakov and to the others who were executed or imprisoned, and to their families. We can't forget there were many more victims. Now, before I get to the story, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the road of Circle of Treason, and it was a long one, as Admiral Daly has indicated. This is the first book that either one of us has ever written, and we certainly don't see ourselves as authors. We were simply two ladies who had a story we wanted to tell. And I might add, we were much older ladies after we finished. Although Ames was arrested in 1994, we did not put pen to paper until 2003. 4 years later, after several serious medical issues and some other interruptions, in 2007, we had completed our first draft, and we submitted it to CIA's Publications Review Board for approval. I'm not going to go into details. I will just say the process was more than difficult. We went back and forth for over 3 years until finally they okayed our manuscript so we could share it with a potential publisher. Nobody else had seen it until that time. But we were not yet finished with the review board. We did not get final approval, final approval, because they had to approve the galleys before the book could go to print until August 15th, 2012. 2012. And sadly, and certainly unknown to us at the time, it was just 6 weeks before Gene's illness was diagnosed. Now to our story, and I must begin with just a brief overview of CIA organization. Don't get nervous. From early 1985 until Rick's arrest in 1994, all the action basically took place in two components in CIA's Directorate of Operations. One was the Soviet East European Division, headed at the time by Burton Gerber, longtime Soviet operations officer, as well as a former chief of station in Moscow. The second component, the Counterintelligence Center, headed by Gus Hathaway, also a longtime Soviet operations officer, as well as a former chief in Moscow. In the spring of '85, Rick and I were both assigned to the Soviet East European Division. I had responsibility for the activities against our targets in Africa. Rick had responsibility for providing counterintelligence guidance to our geographic components. His branch also did case reviews and wrote papers. At this time, Jean was not at headquarters. She was overseas, serving as chief of station in Libreville. Anybody know where Libreville is? Gabon. The Gabon Viper, as Jean would always say. Okay, it's 1985, and our nightmare begins. And it was a nightmare. In the spring of '85, there are big changes in Moscow. Gorbachev is elected leader, but it is business as usual back in Leningrad, and specifically in the Soviet East European Division. And I might add, business is good. We knew more about the KGB and GRU at this time than perhaps any single individual working in them. As one KGB officer would say many, many years later, when talking about the early '85 period, the CIA did not have just one station in Moscow. They had three. There was the traditional one in the American Embassy. There was another one in the middle of KGB headquarters. And there was the third one in the middle of GRU headquarters. Against this backdrop, we have no, I repeat, no indication of the impending disaster. Late May 1985, GRU Colonel Volkan, whom we are handling in Athens, tells us that he has been asked to return to Moscow to take care of a problem involving his son, who's attending a military academy there. Volkan checks with his brother, also in Moscow, who knows of no such difficulty. We advise Volkan to defect rather than return. He agrees, and we bring him safely to the United States. Early August 1985. KGB Colonel Polishchuk is arrested in Moscow during a home leave. Now, this case was quite personal to me because it was my branch's responsibility to keep him alive, as he is assigned to Nigeria. Additionally, Polishchuk's and my association went back 11 years earlier to his days in Kathmandu, Nepal, where he had volunteered to us. Sometime between August and October 1985, GRU officer Smetana is arrested in Moscow, also during a home leave. We are running the case in Lisbon, where he had volunteered to us. November 6th, KGB scientific and technical officer Martinov boards an Aeroflot flight for Moscow. He is on a short trip to Moscow with a rapid return, serving as the escort officer for the famous or infamous KGB defector Vitaly Yurchenko. Now, this operation happens to be joint between the FBI and the CIA. Early November 1985, KGB legal support officer Varenik, whom we are handling in Bonn, tells us that he will be going to East Berlin for a 3-day conference. We never see him again. This case is particularly disturbing because he had only volunteered to us in March of 1985, so there were very few people who were aware of the operation. Now into 1986, March. Moscow station officer Mike Sellers is ambushed on his way to meet a KGB Moscow city director officer, Vorontsov. June or July 1986, as best as we can tell. GRU Colonel Vasilyev, whom we are handling in Moscow, is arrested. This case had begun in Budapest, where Vasiliev volunteered to a U.S. military officer. The U.S. military turned him over to us to handle for the remainder of his tour in Budapest, and the colonel was not very happy. He preferred to deal with his uniformed colleagues, and the fact that his new CIA case officer was a civilian did not sit well with him. It also did not help that she was a she. Nevertheless, we managed to maintain contact with Vasiliev, albeit, and thankfully, with a great deal of help from our military colleagues. Now, 7 July 1986, GRU General Dmitry Polyakov is arrested in Moscow one day after his 65th birthday. The general, who was retired from the GRU at the time, is the highest-ranking Soviet intelligence officer this government has ever run. He was a legend in the corridors of Langley. He was known as our crown jewel, and we as a government had over a 20-year history with him. This one was pretty personal as well. More than half of my CIA career, 26 years, was intertwined with this operation, beginning from the second month after I joined CIA. Unfortunately, we have to go into 1987. KGB Colonel Pebuzov is arrested in Moscow in February. And we have been out of touch with him since 1979, when we were handling, after he left Indonesia, where he was recruited. There's an important point I need to make about all of these arrests. In many, many of the cases, we didn't know that they had occurred until some time later. And Peguzov is a perfect example. Although he was arrested in '87, February, we didn't learn of his arrest for 6 more years. Let's summarize. And obviously the picture is not pretty. In less than 4 months, we have lost 4 reporting sources with no indication as to the reason for their disappearance or their arrest. It is unprecedented. It had never happened. There are 2 theories among the leadership in the Soviet East European Division as well as the Counterintelligence Center. Each is fairly obvious. 1, we have a mole. Or 2, our communications have been compromised. In other words, they're reading our traffic. I want to make a distinction here. Within CIA, there are only 2 components that have investigative authority. One is the Counterintelligence Center, and the other is an obvious one, the Directorate of Security. The Soviet East European Division has none. Its job is simply to recruit and handle sources. Now, for Jean and myself, faced with this whole thing, the most important step taken by the Soviet East European Division at the time was and remained the best thing it could have done. And this was a result of, it was triggered by the appearance of a new source in January 1986. I am called to the office of Burton Gerber. He tells me about, he recounts all of our losses. I'm aware of only one of them, the one involving my branch's source. Don't forget the need-to-know principle here. He tells me about our new source, and he says, I will be part of the effort to try to keep this one alive. I will handle the headquarters end of the operation, all the while remaining as chief of the Africa branch. At the same time, I will report only to Gerber. There will be a handful, there are only a handful of people, or will be a handful of people in the entire agency who are aware of the operation. Secondly, staff communications are out. There will be no cable traffic between headquarters and the concerned field station. So how do we communicate, Mr. Gerber? Well, we go back to basics with a slight twist. The case officer travels from headquarters to the source's location indirectly. He never goes to the country on a direct flight. Secondly, he never goes near the U.S. Embassy in the country. And he meets the asset in a safe house. After the meeting cycle is completed, well, after each meeting, he returns to his room, hotel room, where he transfers his meeting notes onto a laptop computer, and then he encrypts those notes. Once the meeting cycle is completed, he returns to Washington, where we decrypt what had transpired. Now, certainly today, a laptop computer with encryption capabilities is not out of the ordinary. But I have to tell you, in 1986, it was state of the art, and it wasn't exactly user-friendly. Meanwhile, on the counterintelligence side, the Counterintelligence Center side, Gus Hathaway selects Gene to head up a task force to try to determine why we lost all of these sources in 85 and 86. This is upon a return from Gabon in 1986, the fall of 86. Gene's small task force it becomes an analytical effort more than anything. They review the cases, they look for patterns, and they put all the information from these numerous cases that had lasted, a lot of them years and years and years, into digital format. Now, at the same time, Jean and her people were looking at our losses. The FBI was doing the same thing. They had also lost sources. Of course, I mentioned the joint operation, but there were others that they lost during the same 85-86 period. Now, Jean and her group and the FBI, they met frequently, they exchanged information, they exchanged ideas. But after each get-together, including the offsites, there were always more questions than there were answers. Now, I assume you might wonder where Rick was during this whole terrible period, 85, 86. Well, in many respects, he was out of sight, out of mind. The end of 85 until July of 1986, Rick was in Italian language training, which was not at the headquarters building. In July, he and his wife, Rosario, left for assignment to Rome. They returned along with a young son in July 1989, and in September, Rick was again assigned to the Soviet East European Division to position there. Now, this is one of my favorite parts of our story. I hope you find it as interesting as Jean and I found it. While we were trying to stop the hemorrhaging and determine why we lost all these assets, the KGB, still busy with arrests, still busy with executions, began the first of 2 deception operations run against us to answer our questions for us. The first one began in January 1986, just about the same time as our new and legitimate source. We named this individual Mr. X. The second deception operation began in June 1988 and lasted for about 3 years. This one got a cryptonym. It was Gt Prologue. First to Mr. X. Mr. X was a self-described KGB officer who volunteered to us in Bonn via a letter. In his first letter, as well as 4 more, he sent a total of 6, Mr. X told us that our problem was a mole in our communications facility located outside the Washington, D.C. area. Now, per Mr. X's instructions in his letters, he was never met, but we did provide him with money via bed drops in East Berlin. By the fall of '86, everybody had come to believe that Mr. X did not exist. And we severed contact. Now, the Gt Prologue Operation. I don't like to admit this, but boy, the KGB really deserves a great deal of credit for this one. The operation was beautifully conceived, beautifully run, and probably most important, they read us perfectly. As I said, it began in June 1988 when an unidentified Soviet male approached our chief of station in Moscow on the train from Moscow to Leningrad, and he passed him an envelope. Now, the KGB officer, or the Soviet male was later identified himself as a KGB officer. Most important, his name was Zhomov, but that's not what was so terribly important to us as an organization. He not only was a KGB officer, internal counterintelligence, but he happened to be assigned to the component that directed operations and activities against our station in Moscow. Now, in the envelope he passed, that first occasion, there were several KGB documents. One was of extreme importance to Jean and myself. It was KGB's assessment of the activities of our Moscow station from 1984 until the end of '86. Obviously, a very critical period for us. The KGB concluded in this document there was one reason for its successes and our failures, and that was poor tradecraft by CIA's Moscow station officers. Now, what did Zhomov want in return for his continued cooperation? This was not going to be just a one-time, thank you, I'm finished with you. He obviously wanted money. Secondly, he wanted our assistance in leaving the Soviet Union when he told us that the time was right. I won't go into the details here because they're in the book. But in summary, before too long, Jean and I began to believe that Mr. Zhomov was really the son of Mr. X, and that this was a KGB-controlled operation. However, despite many tries over the next couple of years, we were not able to convince the leadership of the Soviet East European Division that this was a KGB-controlled operation. And the exfiltration of Zhomov went forward after he told us that I'm ready to go. As you might expect, Zhomov was a no-show. But he did send us a message. 2 things. 1, your plan's too dangerous. And 2, I will have to break contact. So what do we lose? Well, we did pay Zhomov a great deal of money, which went into the KGB treasury. We also gave the KGB our plans for exfiltrating our assets from the Soviet Union. And if that were not enough, we gave him a valid U.S. passport. So here we are. It's the end of the Zhomov case. It's early 1991, and we do not have a clue. as to what happened in 85 and 86. Now, I do have to say, it's not that there weren't plenty of explanations. There were lots of them. Each was investigated fully, and each was discarded. So you just might be saying to yourself, then how did CIA ever get into the mole hunt business? Enter Jean. She was facing mandatory retirement at the end of 1992 and still felt guilty that she and her task force, as well as her subsequent investigative component, still had not come up with any answer as to why we had lost all these sources. So she wanted to take one more look. She wanted to spend the rest of her time until retirement looking at the cases to see if she could find out what happened. Now, Jean saw that as a solitary effort, but that was soon to change. Enter Paul Redman, new Deputy Chief of the Counterintelligence Center, had just left the Soviet East European Division where he held the same job. He and Jean were scheduled to go to the FBI on a matter totally unrelated to what happened to our sources. After that meeting concluded, Paul just happened to mention that Jean was going to take a new look at all of our losses. The FBI immediately said, "May we join?" Paul said, "Sure." That same afternoon, I get a phone call from Redman. He tells me what's going on, and he said, "Will you join?" And as Admiral Daly said in his remarks, it was the only offer that would keep me working for CIA. I owed it to General Polyakov and Polishchuk in particular. So I left my division, the Soviet East European Division, headed to join Jean and our two colleagues from the Bureau. Special Agent Jim Holt, for any of you who may know him, a great guy. And he had some real skin in this game too, because he happened to be the FBI case officer for Martinov, who was the escort officer, one of the escort officers for Yushchenko. And Martinov, of course, was executed. And FBI Soviet analyst Jim Milburn. Later, we added another member of our team who was extremely valuable. His name is Dan Payne, CIA Office of Security employee who was on rotational to the counterintelligence staff. And Dan was the one who handled all the information, all the activities related to Rick's finances. So, as you can see, what became known as the Ames Mole Hunt Team really was, in many respects, the creation of Paul Redman. He was the catalyst, and he deserves a great deal of credit for any of our successes. Another thing I want to mention, at this particular time, there were many, not many, I shouldn't use the word many, there were some people in CIA who thought that the 85-86 disaster was really just a historical problem. It might be nice to know the answer, but it was not affecting current operations. And why did they believe this? Well, since those security measures instituted by Gerber in January 1986, we had not lost a single new Soviet source. And we were back in business again. So to the people who believe it might be nice to know what happened during that period, it obviously since it was not affecting anything, it obviously no longer existed. How wrong they were. Now, certainly the book covers the work of our task force, so I'm not going to go into, certainly not going to go into detail. I do want to cover several highlights though, but you have to remember, at no time during our deliberations did we ever hide the fact that we were looking for a human penetration of CIA. This was not going to be a paper exercise. So, the first thing we did is pretty obvious, but sort of surprised us. It had an impact, again at the beginning, unbeknownst to us, on I think our eventual success in this whole operation. So the first thing we had to do was identify all those people who knew the sources we lost. We whittled this number down to about 160 without very much difficulty. Now, you have to remember, Polyakov, 20 years, there's lots of people as he's gone back and forth to various field stations. But yes, it's a fairly large number, but there were a lot of cases. Well, so obviously with 160 people, you need an army or navy to investigate it, and it was absolutely impossible within CIA, certainly, and I think probably within the FBI, but my personal opinion. Anyway, we had to find a way to prioritize. Enter Jean again. Her approach was very simple. Certainly not scientific, and I have to tell you, after Rick's arrest, there were a number of very influential, very important people who had very unflattering things to say about how we approach this question. But it did work. Okay, the first thing we did was we asked all members of our task force, at this time only 4, plus 6 other individuals, 4 from the agency, 2 from the FBI, to please list on a piece of paper 5 or 6 people who made them uncomfortable or who bothered them for whatever reason. Now, I have to say, we're looking for a spy. You know, it's not bad breath, it's not... We had to have faith they understood the task. So, 5 or 6 people who bothered them and whom they wanted us to take a close look at first. We also asked one other thing of them. The person who bothered you the most, please make him number 1. Prioritize him, and so on down, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Jean and I took the list, and we assigned a numerical value. If you were in first place on this list, you got 6 points. Second place, 5 points. We totaled the number of points, and what a surprise. Rick Ames was number 1. 21 points. Now, this is not to say we ignored the remaining 154 or 53 people on that initial list. No, we didn't. But there is no question we did concentrate our efforts on our new short list. And eventually, after a period, Rick became our primary suspect. Secondly, was there ever a Eureka moment? Yes, there was, at least to some of us. And it happened in August 1992, just a little over a year after we had begun looking for our traitor. By this time, I was in charge of doing a chronology of all Rick's activities from 1994 until the current time. This document ended up to be over 500 pages. It was mind-numbing to put together, to say the least. However, there was one thing among many others that I'd come across that was interesting. In early 1985, Rick Ames, in alias, was attempting to develop a Soviet arms control specialist named Chubotkin, who was assigned to the embassy here in Washington. Chubotkin was not an intelligence officer. Now, this was a sanctioned contact, known both to the FBI and CIA, and Rick dutifully reported his meetings, each meeting with Chubotkin. That particular August day, Dan, who by this time is on the task force and is gathering all the information on Rick's finances, receives some deposit slips, as well as a few other pieces of paper, from one of the banks where Rick has a checking account. And he logs his information onto his spreadsheet, and after he finished with, there were 3 deposit slips this time. After he finished with one, he'd pass it over the high cubicle wall to Sandy, and Sandy would enter it into the chronology. So, the first one is 18 May 1985. Rick deposits in his checking account cash, $9,000. I just happened to glance up in the chronology. 17 May, the day before, Rick has lunch with Chubotkin. Next deposit slip, 5 July 1985. Rick makes another cash deposit to the same checking account. Well, he does meet Chubotkin, but on 2 July. So we pull out my trusty 1985 perpetual calendar, and obviously the 4th is a holiday, as well as it turns out the 3rd. So this is the earliest time he can make his deposit after a meeting with Chubotkin. 31 July 1985. The cash, what is it? $8,500 in cash. He deposits to his checking account. That same day, he has a lunch meeting with Chubotkin. Now, that is enough for me. I tell Jean, I tell Dan, I tell the 2 Jims, and I head down the hallway to tell Redmond. Many of you here do not know me, so I will apologize in advance. For those of you who do know me, you won't be surprised by my remarks. I burst into Redmond's office, I shut the door, and I said, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what's going on here. Rick is a goddamn Soviet spy. And I leave. And Redmond and I are still arguing over what I exactly said. But what is important about this is it was the first link that would eventually lead to Rick's arrest and conviction. It was cash, it was after his meetings with Chubotkin, and it was below the then $10,000 reporting requirement on the banks. And finally, were Jean and I ever fearful that Rick Ames was going to get away with treason? The answer to that question is also yes. And it happened in early 1993 as our task force was drawing to a close. Late 92, Jim Milburn, remember the FBI Soviet analyst, was preparing a paper with the conclusions of our activities. Now, this was not a CIA document. It was an official FBI document. And while Jean and I had some say in the draft stages, the final wording was not under our control. The report came out in March 1993, and as Jean and I understood it, Rick was not named the primary suspect. His name, however, was included on a list of other possible suspects. This was a terrible time for us. We were Jean and myself, we were absolutely convinced that Rick Ames was our mole we had spent 2 years looking for. Additionally, we knew the FBI didn't share our belief and would continue to look at others on their new shortlist. We simply feared that Rick Ames would fall down a dark bureaucratic hole. He'd never be responsible for the deaths he caused. And he also was at retirement age. We could see him leaving this country along with his wife Rosario, whose family was in Colombia. Both she and Rick had a condo there as well as other property, and living the rest of his life in what Jean, sweet Jean, I don't think I ever heard her swear all those years I knew her. She always referred to his money as blood money, and that's indeed what it was. But, thankfully, and again, I must repeat, thankfully, we received information which indicated that it did not pinpoint, it did not point to Rick excuse me, I shouldn't say this. It did not identify Rick as a spy, but it did point in his direction, and most importantly, it forced the FBI to open a full-scale investigation of Rick Ames. He is now serving a life sentence, arrested 1 year later by the FBI in Allenwood, Pennsylvania, and his wife, Rosario, served 5 years for her guilty plea of espionage in a federal facility in Danbury, Connecticut. She after she got out, she was stripped of her U.S. citizenship and deported. And that concludes my remarks. We won this battle.